Do you know that every cell in your body is currently being healed? Watching this lovely and meaningful video will take you one step closer to finding your true love. Let's get this party started.
So we have two ways that we actually face crisis. We can either face crisis in a state of emergency, which in the beginning of a crisis is healthy, or we can face crisis in a state of creativity and innovation. So let's talk about that biologically, because it says a lot about how a culture responds, or a person individually. When you and I react to conditions in our life, stressful conditions, we turn on a very primitive nervous system called the fight or flight nervous system, or what's called the sympathetic nervous system. And when we react to our external environment and we see a chaos or a threat or a trauma, our primitive nervous system tells us that we either have two options. We either run or we fight. And we mobilize enormous amounts of energy because from a historical standpoint, running and fighting from a predator was the best way for our chances of survival. So our stressors have become a little bit more complex. We have finances, we have jobs, we have traffic jams, we have internet connections, we have second mortgages, we have single parenting. And all of these elements turn on that primitive nervous system as if we're being chased by a lion. So in the short term, all organisms in nature can deal with short-term stress. A zebra gets chased by a lion, 15 minutes later it goes back to grazing and the stress is over. It returns back to homeostasis. Now, stress is when your body and brain are knocked out of balance. The stress response is what your body innately does to return itself back to order. So, we know from a scientific standpoint that when you turn on the stress response and you can't turn it off, now you're headed for disease. Now you're headed for some type of breakdown. So, if you look at a crisis in terms of emergency, and we're releasing all these primitive chemicals of adrenaline and cortisol, those chemicals create the emotional states of anger, of frustration, of aggression, of hatred, of fear, of anxiety, of insecurity, of hopelessness, of powerlessness, of guilt, of shame, of depression. Those chemicals of stress bring us to a lower denominator. And what we know from those chemicals is that most people will do the same exact thing and react in predictable ways, but expect something to change in their life. In other words, those chemicals endorse the ego, and we become very selfish. We become self-indulgent, self-centered, self-involved, self-important, self-serving, full of self-pity. It's all about the self. Now, this is the tragedy, because in crisis, if you're addressing a financial crisis or a crisis in a culture and everybody is selfish and everybody's living by those emotions, then they're pushing their way to get to the head of the line. They're competing. They're forcing outcomes. They're using very primitive systems to try to take care of themselves. We don't see possibility. We feel separate from each other. We are competing and striving to get to the head of the line by using our cunning, manipulative, egocentric ways to get there. And we're very controllable. Fear is very controllable. Competition is very controllable. Anger and war divides individuals. Now, that is not a way to address a crisis, because the service to self, or taking care of the self, is the exact thing that enhances the crisis. Because if you and I are all doing the same, if we're all doing the same thing, then a culture becomes more divided. It becomes more disintegrated. It becomes more incoherent. And possibility then is not part of the equation. So, the other state of mind, if you can view crisis as a great opportunity brilliantly disguised as an impossible situation, and you have to match the conditions in your environment with a new mind. Now we're talking about greatness, because innovation and creativity and a new way of thinking and a new way of being means that we can't do the same thing from the past. And so in history, cultures that, or individuals that overcame their environmental conditions were considered mystics and saints and leaders and charismatic leaders. They were individuals that saw past the illusion of the present reality. Now, when we begin to become innovative or creative, the brain begins to switch. We begin to turn on the forebrain, the frontal lobe, which is really the crowning achievement of the human being, and we begin to ask bigger questions. How can we create a new way of being in a world that's falling apart? How can we begin to create a new system to adapt to these conditions? Now, the hardest part, without a doubt, in all of my research about change is not making the same choice as you did the day before. So reason this. You think 60 to 70,000 thoughts in one day. Out of those 60 to 70,000 thoughts that you think, 90% of those thoughts are the same thoughts as the day before. So the same thoughts will lead to the same choices. The same choices will lead to the same behaviors. The same behaviors will create the same experiences. The same experiences create the same emotions, and those same emotions drive the same thoughts, and that's called a personality. And your biology is a reflection of your state of being. So then your personality is directly related to your personal reality. And your personality is made up of how you think, how you act, and how you feel. So in order for you to create a new personal reality, a new life, then you have to begin to examine the thoughts that you're thinking and decide if you want to continue thinking that way or choose a new way of thinking. So most people try to create a new personal reality as the same personality, and it doesn't work. We literally have to become somebody else. So it stands to reason then, as you begin to question and speculate possibilities, the Wright brothers, Madame Curie, Thomas Edison, Benjamin Franklin, Marconi, they were all thinking outside the box. They were asking questions. Is there a way to create this outcome? And when they began to think in new and unusual ways, new thoughts lead to new choices. New choices lead to new behaviors. New behaviors lead to new experiences create new emotions, and all of a sudden you start to transform. So, in order to change a culture, you have to change individuals. We have to change it individual by individual. Now, this requires then, by not making the same choices you did the day before, to begin to think and act in different ways.
Did our video satisfy your soul in some way? Thank you a million times over for your help. We appreciate it more than you can imagine. Don't forget to leave us a comment and hit the subscribe